Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So Antonia, you and I have, after many decades on this earth, not too many, but many decades on this earth, we found ourselves here in the middle of our lives, where we have our parents who have aged into elderhood. Your father, unfortunately, has passed away at this point, but your mother's aged into elderhood. My parents have. And we have children and dependents that look up to us as parents and the adults in the situation. And I've realized that at midlife, there is no more opportunity for me to adulting at all. I have to actually be an adult and show up in a mature way as a person that kind of is between two worlds. I feel the squeeze of the most time, financial responsibility, like health, like everything feels pressured right now.
Yeah.
I feel really bad for all the middle-aged people I ever made fun of for getting older because it's tough. For me, at least, I don't want to speak for you, but it's a challenge being at this part of life.
Yeah. There's
a lot going on. A lot of changes are happening and a lot of responsibilities come on our shoulders, I think, as midlifers. They're very unique to this time period. Mm-hmm. Do you experience something very similar?
Yeah, absolutely. The squeeze is the perfect way to explain it. And yeah, I mean, nobody cares, right? Like 100% of people are completely unsympathetic. Well, not 100%. Everybody else going through the same thing is like, yeah, it's a thing. But when you're young, it's almost like you have disdain for people who survived into midlife and older. Well, it's like you should have died young or something.
And we don't get student discounts anymore.
No. Right? No, you get nothing. You get the most taxed, the highest prices, the most dependence upon you, right? You still have that little bit of energy from youth, but every day you're like, why am I tired? Why am I sore? What's happening? Because everything's sort of descending, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's I would say that there are a lot of great things that come from being in midlife. It's an extraordinary opportunity, and it really is this beautiful intersection of the last of my physical youth with the beginning of a totally different, mature, seasoned way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And so I have a feeling that this is actually a really nice time period. I'm trying to kind of slurp it up as much as I can.
Yeah.
But there are disadvantages, which is, and then everybody's like, you should be doing everything.
Well, and existentially, the thing I struggle with is I feel like I'm standing on the precipice of my own irrelevance. Like, because I look at older people, I saw a post on social media somewhere, some 70-year-old man, this young person was interviewed, what's it like to be 70? And they kind of joked a little bit, but then they said, well, basically, you see the world the same, you've always seen it, but you notice that other people see you very differently. You don't see yourself differently unless you're looking in the mirror and you're looking out through the windows of your eyes. Everything looks the same to you. I mean, there's changes in your life, but people all of a sudden respond to you differently. And he said, I feel like I'm worthless at the age of 70. I feel like no one gives me the time of day. I feel like I don't have a lot. Other people don't think I have a lot to offer. And I'm standing on the precipice of that going, I don't want to be irrelevant. I want to stay relevant. I don't want that to fade away. And that's a tough thing to confront at this point of life.
Yeah. Well, and we used to honor people who had survived that long. And so they weren't irrelevant. They were the sources of oral traditions and institutional knowledge about culture. And they were people we tapped into for wisdom. And because it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal to survive later, and because we have such a ridiculous bias towards technology, and the younger you are, the more adept you are with technology, there's this sense that older people don't have anything left to offer. And I will say 100% of us this time, 100% of us have that looking forward to look forward to. Even if it's in your distant future, it's coming. Well, you're lucky if it's coming. If it's not coming for you, if that irrelevance later on is not coming for you, that means you died young. So all of us have that to look forward to. So it's kind of sad. It's sad that we no longer have the reverence and respect for people in their elderhood that we once did. And so, so we're going to be those people.
So someone that spent some time talking about midlife was the same person that we based the Myers-Briggs system on and personality type, that we work with, which is Carl Jung. He spent a lot of time talking about midlife. In fact, he was unique in that a lot of people at his time and even now, don't really address midlife in the same way that maybe elderhood or young adults are addressed, or even childhood development. Like midlife's, again, it's kind of ignored in a lot of like social sciences and all these things. There's some, knowledge around it. But Carl Jung was very focused on this. This was something very important to him. He put a lot of focus and attention to this time period of life.
Yeah. In fact, I would say that his research on it is some of the best still to this date.
Yeah.
And it's because, like you said, midlife, the Gen X of the levels of development. And it's interesting that Gen Xers, who are also totally ignored, are in midlife. That is a totally ignored time period. So, it's that's a very interesting convergence. But that said, midlife is a fascinating time period, or all of a sudden it has become to me, probably because I'm entering it. But midlife has a lot to offer in terms of development. And we don't always see that. And I think because it's ignored and neglected, most people are not encouraged to use midlife in this way. Like, we could be using it as a rebirth time period. And we don't always do that because we don't know that that's just sitting on the table for us. So I really got into this idea of levels of development that humans go through being massively influential in type. In conversations with Dr. Dario is a friend of ours, and we were talking about how type development is crucial for understanding type at all. In a previous podcast, we discussed how if you aren't into personal growth, you have a cap on how much you can understand type theory. And effectively, because we define personal growth as an acceleration of maturity.
Yeah.
And that's what development does, is it matures us over time.
So, by the way, speaking of that, in the last episode, we talked about this idea of maturity and how growth helps us mature. And I realized that what a great framework as the metric, as the outcome of growth. I think a lot of people connect happiness to personal growth. Like, oh, I want to personally grow so I can be happy. Mm-hmm. I think happiness is a byproduct.
Can be.
I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily going to happen if you grow. In fact, sometimes it can create unhappiness. Mm-hmm. But I think it will create maturity. And often maturity, properly used, can create happiness for you, or at least joyfulness in your life. So I just want to make that comment real quick.
Yeah, well, I think when we're mature, we spot opportunities for happiness and can make them happen a little easier.
Yeah.
It just greases the wheels of that. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it definitely makes it so that if it's possible, we are as ready for happiness as we can be.
Yeah.
and to move into that arena. That said, I got really into this concept of levels of development being huge influence in type with my conversations with Dario. And then I started going down a rabbit's hole of looking at this. And in fact, in our Profiler training program, we do a virtual event once every 6 months for everybody who's in the Profiler training, ecosystem. And the last one I did, I presented an entire, all day event around understanding how levels of development are crucial in our profiling, because we're going to show up differently depending upon what time period of life we're in. And I did quite a bit of research into Erik Erikson's model, because he's basically foundationally the person who talks about levels of development in childhood. But at a certain point, Erikson just stops talking about development. And in all of my research, I mean, there are people who talk a little bit about midlife, but at that point, it really is Jung's work that is the best to pivot to. So combining these two, in my opinion, both of them are geniuses, but these two geniuses' work ended up creating a model of effectively like 5 different levels of development and the kinds of things our egos are going to go through. And maybe how our function development, like our relationship to our cognitive functions based on our type, how those will also be folded into following this process or procession of our general ego development.
No, before you get into this specific, you're going to put more specificity to this, more fidelity to this. Let me just broad brush this in a really, really high level for a second. We could look at somebody's life, and we've talked about this on just recent podcasts. We talked about generational theory. The average lifespan, let's say, is about 80 years. So you could broadly divide a person's life into 4 broad sections of life. It could be childhood, which is 0 to 20, young adulthood, 20 to 40, midlife, 40 to 60, elderhood, 60, 80 plus, right? And beyond.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those ages may not match what you're ready to go into right now, but I'm just saying that's like a real quick snapshot that you could divide into life. Now, more fidelity can get more specific about the dates or the ages, but also I think childhood is pretty broad in a 20-year span. Like most people, the 2020 chunk,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very different in, like when you're 8 than when you're 18. Like you're a very different person. And so we could really split early childhood into early childhood and maybe adolescence, the teenage years, and then into young adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what this model is going to do. It's going to actually have these 5 sections. It's going to break apart those younger years into 2 sections. So maybe frame this. Those again are my broad brush attempt without looking at the data on your sheet. So
Yeah.
Go ahead and lead us into this now.
So the stages of development add one more time period than what you're talking about, because it separates like early childhood from adolescence, since there is so much development that happens in those 2 time periods. They're 10-year chunks effectively.
Yeah.
But my goodness, they're rich with changes and development. And like I mentioned, if you act like a 5-year-old when you're 10, that's a problem. But when you act like you're a 25-year-old when you're 30, people are just like, maybe you should stop partying so much. It's not as big of a deal. And when you act like you're 40 when you're 45, people are like, you just don't seem your age. So definitely when you're really young in that more youthful time period, all of those developmental phases are massive. And Erickson, basically the theory was that children develop and mature based on psychological quandaries that they're trying to figure out. And the ego has to it doesn't just figure it out in I guess this is the solution. It takes it on as a part of its identity now, or it takes it on as part of how it sees itself. And so these levels of development, effectively, the quandaries or the psychological problems are trust, autonomy, initiative, industry, identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity. So these different challenges or problems are basically like, is the world friendly or hostile? Can I trust it? And that shows up in early childhood, which is between 0 and 11, effectively. And that question of trust is crucial to how our type is going to develop. Because if we can or cannot trust the outside world, we're going to have more or less permission to assert those aspects of our personality that are looking for opportunities to hone and develop and grow. So if I'm a little ESTP, say, in a world that is not friendly towards me, it's hostile, then every time I show up with my little extroverted sensing or sensation dominant driver function, and it gets slapped down, or, I don't think that I can trust the world to be safe, I'm not going to take as many chances or risks. I'm not going to play out my extroverted sensing or sensation in a way that might really hone its capacities young. I'm going to be more withdrawn. I'm going to withhold. I'm going to be sort of maybe more receptive than assertive. And that's going to totally show, that's going to show up in my behavior and in my mannerisms. So you can already see how those kinds of things massively influence our relationship to our type, because they're influencing ourselves, and type is just an aspect of ourselves. So the next question of autonomy is, can I trust my judgments or should I feel shame? And all of these can go the wrong way. Like you can be a maladaptive version of it, or you can be a malignant version of it as well, or you can be the healthy version in between. So you can either overdo it, underdo it, or do it just right if you've got the right context or circumstances. And this idea of autonomy, should I feel shame? Now we're also talking about whether or not can I hand myself over to the environment, and will it, be there for me? Is it hostile? Do I have to fight? Going back to that ESTP, maybe they're taking lots of risks, but they think they have to fight everybody all the time. Now in autonomy, it's not just, can I trust the environment? It's, well, is it okay for me to have permission to be myself, right? Or do I have to constantly and perpetually be leaning on other people to give me my marching orders? Do I have any sense of autonomy for myself? And the third one being initiative is, should I lead or should I follow? So this idea of, can I trust my own judgments or should I feel ashamed of my judgments? And do I have the ability to set my own path, or do I have to follow somebody else's path? These are all things that are getting almost imprinted inside children between the ages of 0 and 11. And this sets the tone for how they're going to see life until they reprogram themselves, which usually doesn't happen with people. So unless reprogramming happens, this is how they see reality in this way forever.
And we're saying that the context of and those three things are in the early childhood, 0 to 11. Is that right?
And there's more in there too.
Oh, okay. Because you did name 6 things. So, but I just want to anchor this in to say this is context of your early childhood and your personality type wiring, your cognitive wiring, your learning and decision-making frameworks. Those two things in combination are going to make you a particular type of person in early childhood.
Yeah. Well, and also what you come pre-wired with, and the environment's response to that pre-wiring is also going to create some of this. Like, if you have the same personality type as your parent, as the most influential parent, or maybe the most assertive parent between, whatever your living situation is, and you have the same personality type, they're going to understand everything you're doing, and they're going to encourage it, and they're going to go, I wish somebody had done this for me. And so you might actually have a really great context to foster all of this, but at the same time, they might never encourage you to do anything outside of that.
Yeah.
So it's going to maybe be very, encouraged to be who you are, and you might have a lot of, autonomy, and I'm okay with trusting my judgments, but I might not have the permission to step outside that zone. That's going to influence type versus somebody who has a very different personality type from that assertive parent. And everything they're doing, it's like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? What's going on? Why do you think this is okay? And they're going to get a lot of feedback that they can't trust their judgments.
Yeah.
So just the type dynamics between yourself and your parents, that's going to influence a lot of these different imprints. And so type definitely comes in here, but it's both on in how the environment is responding to your personality type, and then the lessons you're taking about who you are, and then that influencing how that type is now going to start showing up. So it's complex, right? It's a system, as almost everything is. This is a system, and it informs and influences all different ways that, type preferences can be really, like it's flavors behavior. It flavors, how we think about who we are. It flavors so many different elements that show up in type.
Yeah. So as we continue, you want to talk more about some of the other characteristics? I know we got to 3 of them. So,
well, the final one in early childhood is industry, which is, can I take pride in my achievements? And so this is the part of childhood that goes, did I do a good job? Right? And not just with approval, but also, can I take pride in what I have to offer as a person? And then, of course, that is also going to very much influence how our type shows up. Because in large part, our pre-wiring, our type cognitive function pre-wiring is really about which aspects of life am I pre-wired to be fascinated by, and what is my purpose? Like, what am I meant to steward? Which aspects of life am I meant to steward and make sure is represented? And so this industry component is also, it also influences our type, because it lets us know whether or not one of the ways that we see ourselves as having like purpose as people is in our function set, right? Like, to some extent, it's my job to make sure that extroverted intuition or exploration is not only represented, but it's represented well, and I'm stewarding it. I'm ensuring that other people don't forget that it doesn't exist. And that's part of my purpose. And I think all of us, to some extent, have our type preferences, our function preferences, as part of our purpose. And so how we're imprinted when we're young, whether or not we have industry, whether or not there is value to us, is also going to show up in our type.
Yeah.
So adolescence, Erickson separates early childhood from adolescence by talking about this time period as being approximately like 12 to 18. And identity and intimacy are the big ones that show up here. And in part because, puberty begins. It's impacting both the brain and our physicality, right? Like, our bodies and our brains are massively influenced by this. And so questions of identity really come up, like, who am I? And intimacy, who am I in relationship to other people? These are big questions that get answered during this time period, or at least get asked a lot during this time period. And so who are the people in our lives? Like, are we allowed to be who we are? Are we allowed to rest into our identity and who we're going to be in relationship with, like, society around us and culture? Are there people we can trust, right? It goes back to that early concept of trust, but are there people that we can have intimate relationships with, really share our hearts with, or our bodies, right? These are the kinds of things that are big questions when we're teenagers. And who those people end up being, what the answers end up being, these are all going to, again, impact our type. And our type is going to impact how the environment responds to us and answers those questions for us. So in early childhood, you can see why so much is there at the early phase, 0 to 11, trust, autonomy, initiative, industry. There's constant growth and constant changes between 0 and 11. It's just, that is the norm of that time period.
Yeah.
When you get into adolescence, the fact that puberty starts taking over and massively impacts your mind and your body simultaneously in all these crazy hormonal ways. And it tells you to come online to your relationship to the outside world, right? What is your marketplace value in the crudest terms I can think of, right? That's pretty crude, but it's like, am I going to be able to mate?
Biologically, what's your value biologically? Who can you mate with is really the unconscious question every teenager's asking.
Yeah, and constantly. It's hard to get that thought out of your head. It's like sometimes I get to listen to music and sometimes I get to play video games, but most of the time I'm just thinking about that and my little social ecosystem. So it's fewer things are imprinted during that time period, but those are still really big. And early adulthood. Well, and by the way, during this time period, gender roles are very influential during this time period. In fact, it might be the most influential to our cognitive development. Our friend Dario says that up into the age of 25, gender, it has some of the biggest impact on how types show up in
EEG brain scans.
That's right, exactly. And you can kind of tell, the difference between, say, a female ENFP brain and a male ENFP brain. But after 25, it stops. So during this time period, gender roles, gender, sort of how we respond and react to all of that, it's very influential in these kinds of components.
Well, and that would make sense because chemicals and hormones affect a lot of things about personality type that we've understood, especially in the recent past. We've been aware of different chemicals speak to maybe a person's subtype, how they show up with a little flavoring of their type based on the chemicals that are overwhelming their brain.
Yeah, which neurotransmitters do we have a tendency to be more sort of associated with? And two of those, based on the work of Dr. Helen Fisher, is testosterone and estrogen. So yeah, it's very influential. And then we enter early adulthood. Early adulthood is approximately 19 to 38. Now, Erickson's work starts to drop off around here. But there's a couple different pieces that Erickson is still interested in that show up here, particularly generativity. Now, in early adulthood, the biologically driven body and brain development completes. All right, so that phase of our life kind of cools down, which is nice because now we get to a place where we're like, oh, okay, so there aren't constant and perpetual changes that are happening. I get to kind of chill out on that developmental level. But now I get to be more interested in my relationship to the outside world. Now it's less about all of these changes and just trying to keep up with them. And now it's like, okay, I'm at a baseline of this is pretty much where I'm going to be for a while. So what else is going on? And this is where generativity really come in. Generativity is what will be my contribution? This is a little different than industry, which is, do I get to take pride in my achievements? Can I achieve things? What do I have to offer? This is more, what is my contribution going to be? Like, what as a person am I going to decide to offer to the world? More in even than just a value exchange way, more like what's going to be my thumbprint, right?
Yeah. Whereas industry might be more of a metric, like almost a key performance indicator of what I'll measure of the output. This is, what do I want the output to be at all, in a way. Yeah,
exactly. And it sort of pits the development of the ego against the demands of life, effectively, right? It's no longer the demands of changing bodies. It's more like, well, life is now expecting more out of me. So how is my ego going to respond to that?
Does generativity also relate to child rearing or having children? Is that also what it means?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, like you're generating more humans for sure. That
like
could
biologically, we want to generate more.
Yeah, that could be your contribution, is that you have a family, you have children. And a lot of people go down that path. That is their contribution to the world, is that they make more people. And then they try to steward these people and make them good people, right? Good humans.
Yeah.
And so that's very much part of generativity. And here, career choice becomes the most influential part, right? Up to 25, it's gender. After 25, you kind of can't tell, especially considering the person's career choice. And that's the demands of life. So now our egos, or really our cognitive capacities and processes, are very much being shaped by what we're spending 40 hours a week doing. And, 40 hours a week is the average amount of time that we spend at our jobs. And that's a chunk of change, right? That's a ton of time. So if we're a person who has certain type preferences, but we end up in a career choice that forces us out of those preferences, and we've got to sort of learn other skills or maybe use our skills in a unique, interesting way to meet the demands of our career or our job, that's going to absolutely influence how our type shows up. Like, we just recently met ENFP, a person with ENFP preferences and a person with ESFP preferences, and both of them were sort of the top dogs of the regulation component of a medical industry company.
Yeah.
So they're the ones who decide whether or not
they're in compliance or not.
They're in compliance. ENFP, ESFP. This is a very different career path than people would assume people of that type would enter, and it absolutely influenced how they showed up. Absolutely, it influenced sort of basically their behavior and their attitude. They were both quite chill, actually. They were way more chill than you would expect EFPs to be, or is the stereotype around EFPs. But that is very common. And then you'll have people choose careers that are very much in alignment with their personality types, and then they get really sort of doubled down on that style. Those two people, an ENFP that maybe is in performance, right, or marketing or some other, career choices that are common for ENFPs, and one that's in regulation and compliance, they can both have ENFP preferences, but they're going to show up very different based entirely on their career choice.
They have to show up different based on their career type, or they won't survive. I mean, if you showed up like a performance ENFP in a compliance framework, it's not going to go, you're not going to last very long. Let's just put it that way. And the people we met have lasted long. They have basically wired themselves to be very much proficient at their career choices. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I have some patterns I'm picking up here, some things I want to throw out, but I don't want to disrupt the flow. So this might be a good time to pause and just throw them out before I forget them.
Well, we can pause here because this is where we conclude Erickson and pick up Jung.
Oh, okay, great. Before we go into midlife, before we go over the hill. So a couple of things that are coming up for me as I listen is this feels like an old model. This feels like this is not relevant anymore because, first of all, I don't believe development has been arrested, but it has been delayed in a way. In other words, I would argue that a lot of people, even in their 20s into their 30s at this point in our world, the people I run into, are still dealing with identity and intimacy issues. Like that didn't get figured out in adolescence. And I think technology, both social and actual technology, have extended adolescence well into our 20s, into young adulthood. I mean, I just took you weren't with us, but I took the kids out to eat the other day to like a chain restaurant. And I noticed the tables were set up. When I was a kid, they were set up with like small family units, like 5 seats around a table. And I was noticing this chain restaurant that used to be set up that way has now long rows for about like 15 to 20 people to gather around like a table. And it's like a high top table for people to have drinks and appetizers and food around this. And I was going, that's an interesting setup. And I realized, they're adjusting to the cultural changes that young adults aren't going out and having children, starting families and doing what quote unquote happened when Erickson was doing his research. They're still, in a lot of ways, living a very youthful, social, connected life. They're not getting married and having children in the same way past generations did. And so groups of 20-somethings are probably, and even 30-somethings are going out together as like 10, 20 people and sharing an evening out. And I'm watching restaurants all of a sudden accommodating this. And I'm realizing culture is shifting very fast and definitively in this way. So it'd be interesting to see how this affects our personality type development because we're not going down these same markers we once did. So immediately I'm going, a lot of young adults are dealing with identity and the intimacy issues. And then they're not necessarily having that generative child experience, which I'm wondering if having children also adds some level of maturity to you, or there's probably some development we go through as people when we have a child and we have to be responsible now for this other human. It's got to do something to our brains and our personalities. It's got to change our wiring. And I mean, it did for me, so I'm assuming it does for other people. So those are just two things that were coming up for me in the midst of this conversation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I agree. I think that adolescence is being extended. Early adulthood is being extended. I think everything is being extended. In fact, we even talked about this when we did the generational theory podcast, that one of the people who developed that system said that everything is dilating. Like the seasons are dilating. The extension of sort of what they call the saculums are dilating. Everything is stretching out because of effectively the phenomena that you're referring to. The concept of having children as part of your contribution maturing you, I think that there's a lot of people who would push back against that.
Yeah.
They would say, no, having children doesn't mature you. I know tons of terrible parents or immature parents. And I would actually say, I think it matures almost everybody. But what was their starting point?
Yeah.
Right? Like if a person becomes a parent and they're a terrible parent and they're still not very mature as a parent, I think their starting point was pretty far behind, because parenting requires you to do a bunch of hard things that you just can't get out of.
Well, you put yourself aside, first of all. You can't make yourself the priority. If you've got a screaming child that's helpless, you have to attend to them.
Right.
Not all parents do, but you're supposed to, because it can't help itself.
Yeah, the parents who are wildly neglectful, those are the ones it doesn't mature. Yeah. Right? If you're wildly neglectful of your child, then you are not maturing as a parent. But anybody who's paying any attention to their children, they are being forced into maturing. Even if it's slow, even if it's gradual, even if it's just a tiny little bit, they are going to mature from the experience. We
are not saying that you can't mature in similar ways or in other ways. We're just saying that it does mature somebody to have a child. Mm-hmm. But you can also do it through other means.
Yeah, well, the entire last episode was about how personal growth accelerates maturing.
Yeah.
Right. So you can do it through other facets. You can choose personal growth processes or projects or whatever to replicate a similar thing. And usually it's through contribution, right? It's like the one thing that kids do is they make it so that you can't not do it. That's why they mature everybody for the most part. Not everybody, but most people. Even if your starting point was way back here, you're probably going to get at least a couple bumps up. For people who take the job seriously, they go through a massive maturing process because they realize how much they have to step up to have good, to have these children be prepared for the world. And whether or not we agree with other people's parenting, it doesn't mean that they as an individual are not maturing through this process and experience.
Could we say that it always has you reprioritize your priorities? Like, mm-hmm. It always has you reorganize your priorities in life?
Yeah.
Regardless of whether you rise to those priorities or not, you do have different priorities on your radar.
Yeah.
Even if you're a quote unquote bad parent.
Yeah. And you decentralize your ego. Like, it's no longer just you and your ego. Now it's also, you have this little ego replication project. Yeah. No, not all parents do that. I sometimes say that the ego likes to hitch a ride with the DNA in our children. That's why they have to experience all the same things I experienced, and they have to have all the same things that I did, right? And it's because you want them to turn into a little replica of you.
Yeah.
And while I think that that's not as mature as allowing your children to have their own, egos form and emerge over time, I still think that simply the decentralization of it onto some other figure is in and of itself going to teach a bunch of lessons.
The process of writing a note on a big piece of paper, handing it to your child, and taking a picture and posting on social media.
Right.
As if they're on your ideological train as well. And they're like 3. They're like, yeah, this ideology, whatever it is, your religion, your ideology, anything.
Right. My 7-year-old repeated something I told them. See, even 7-year-olds get it. I'm like, no, they're just parroting whatever you said, because that's where they're at. But yes, exactly. But even in that situation, I would say that person is more mature than they were before the child was born.
Yeah, by that.
And contribution of any kind requires that of us, because now we are making commitments to the world that we believe we have to follow through with, because contribution is not an afternoon activity, right? I'm not contributing to the world by doing something for a couple hours, right? I'm doing it by committing to something long-term, building something, trying to make something happen in the outside world that I believe is important. And so that level of commitment in and of itself, it's not a screaming child in the middle of the night, but it is a commitment. And I am doing something for others, and I am taking my ego and decentralizing it onto a broader, landscape. So I think that you can do it in other ways as well. But I do think parenting it's the fastest biological hack to getting there.
Well, and in the last episode, I talked about how growth really covers the absence of biological pressures that we used to feel as humans. Just like going to the gym, our ancestors didn't have to go to the gym because they had all sorts of circumstances and situations in their life that built muscle, built muscle tone, built speed, agility, all these things. They had to hunt, gather, all the things they had to do. Same with the personal growth. There were a lot of biological things naturally built into our lives that we now have to synthetically seek out because society will let us off the hook. Society does not have a lot of the same pressure we used to have, or at least our ancestors used to have. So growth is a synthetic kind of connection to those tensions to force us to grow. Before we move on to also midlife, I just want to make one more pattern comment is a lot of the things you just mentioned through Eric Erickson's work match up at least loosely to Timothy Leary's 8-circuit model, the first 4 circuits, the oral survival circuit, the anal territorial circuit, was the social sexual, and the time binding circuits. And those are all through 0 to 20 as well. And Leary's model, often that's how it's reported. We've talked about Leary's model in other podcasts a long time ago in the audio podcast. And maybe we'll unpack that again in the future. But I just want to make attention to that too, that I think we're onto something here because it seems to match also Leary's.
I suspect that Leary's work was based on Erickson's work.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So
I thought it was doing acid trips, but
probably a little both. Probably a little both.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
So Erickson is fully complete at this point.
Yeah.
He didn't really go beyond.
You're over 40, screw you.
That's right. We're
It's
done
Eric
with you.
Erickson's view.
But now we pass the torch to Carl Jung, who was a massive pioneer in this concept of what happens in midlife. And I think particularly because he was not just looking at the ego, he was looking at whole self.
Yeah.
He himself had experiences around what that meant and doing what's called shadow work. This idea that there's more to explore than just the ego, that's Jung's, in my opinion, that's part of his masterpiece of understanding. And so handing the reins over to Jung in midlife, which is approximately like 39 years old to 65 years old. Now, of course, obviously, the thing that's really going to start hitting you is, remember when we stopped developing physically? Well, now we're back in physical changes, right?
Yeah.
Like that idea of early adulthood when you just hang there for a while. Well, we're on the other side of that hill, and as opposed to going up, now we're starting to head on down, which is why they called people in midlife over the hill, right? So you've got a lot of signs of aging. They don't just become a thing, they become increasingly relevant, right? Like I'm getting bags under my eyes, or I've got crow's feet is now becoming like, I can't get up in the morning. Like I'm really very sore and I got to figure this out because it hurts, and I have a scar in my skin that would have healed up in 2 weeks before, but now it's taken 6 months. And, these are the kinds of things that increasingly happen.
This would be the time of life when all the habits, whether they're good or bad, are coming home to roost. Like we're actually feeling the results of the habits we've had for the last 20 years, maybe 40 years in our life. All of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, that certainly served me. Thank God I had that habit. Or, oh my God, I got to adjust this because this is killing me now.
Yeah, I spent 20 years going to bed with a bowl of ice cream, and that was fine, but now it's not fine.
Yeah.
Now I got to do something about this. I got to turn this ship around. Or we don't. We just keep going to bed with a bowl of ice cream, and that now becomes a can we kick into elderhood.
Is this your personal experience, Antonia?
This is something I watch my father do, actually. Yeah. So that now enters a place of what Erickson would call the psychological struggle of integrity starts to pop up, which is basically, does my life have meaning? Right? Am I living a life of meaning? And it's integrity because oftentimes we don't have a life of meaning if we've outsourced everything to everybody else. Our meaning is ours. And we get to decide that, and we get to build upon this idea of whether or not we have permission and autonomy and self-leadership and all those other things that we learned earlier on. Now they're all culminating in like, why am I doing this? What is going on? Why am I getting up every morning? I don't seem to be, compelled by the same motivations as I was when I was younger. Now I've got to kind of figure out, like, am I going to leave a mark? Not just what's my contribution, but am I going to leave an imprint?
No.
Do I care whether or not the things that I'm doing every day are something that I want to be doing? And how do I know if it's what I want to be doing? How do I know if I'm in integrity with who I am?
So I look at this part of life as a massive opportunity to reevaluate, potentially to hit the reset button or multiple reset buttons on life while you still have time. Because there is some element of youth. I mean, there's some energy here at midlife. You don't lose all your faculties. You're not blind. You're not deaf. You're not like... Your body's not falling apart to the point where you're senile yet, often. But you have capacity, you still have energy, you still have attunement, you're still hip and young enough to do those changes, but that window is going to start closing. So the opportunity is not going to be forever, but you do have an opportunity at midlife to make changes. And I think often people come into our world here at Personality Hacker that are at this moment. They're in their mid to late 30s, approaching midlife, or they're in midlife, and they go, I think the life I've built is not serving me. It's not ergonomically designed for the personality type that I am. All the systems I have set up, all the people I've surrounded myself with, and all my career choices have led me here. And I'm not sure this is actually what I wanted. And do I have the opportunity to reset? I think absolutely yes. Mm-hmm. Now, the work that somebody has to do varies depending on how, like, all the systems that got them there. Some people have more work than others. But this is actually a very exciting time of life, I think. And because it's that reevaluation, but the thing that hijacks it, what we talked about at the very beginning of the podcast, is you have all this pressure. You got, our society, at least here in the West, is set up to where this is the least, you have the most opportunity in your cognitive wiring, but outside of that, you don't have as much opportunity because you might have kids and parents and jobs and taxes and all the things you have to tune to. So it's a delicate balance, but you have an opportunity here. I think it's awesome.
Well, you have like you said, all those decisions that you have to now figure out, right? All the choices you made in your youth, you've got to sort it all out. And when you were talking about before, you're talking about age-related limited abilities, right? You're not like blind or deaf or anything.
I'm not trying to be ableist. I understand people have limitations, and yes.
Well, that's relevant. I wasn't going to call you out on that. I was actually going to say more like when you're used to having something and they start going away, that's a completely different thing than if you have lived your life with, limited abilities. It's like now you feel something's being taken from you. Yeah. Over time.
And thank you for clarifying that, because I wouldn't want somebody to get the impression that I think anything less of somebody that has to go through that experience.
Right, exactly. Well, and I would imagine that if, no matter what you're working with, when you're used to life being a certain way and things start being taken away from you, even then, it's very disconcerting. Like, it doesn't matter what your starting point was. It's like when age starts to remove its gifts, it's like, oh, I gotta probably figure some stuff out.
Yeah.
And so this time period is a time period where we start to slow down just a bit. We're not fully slowing down, but we do have usually often we have a really fast pace of life that we know we have to get a handle on. We understand the value of maybe slowing things down just a hair. No, not everybody does that. Some people amp it up. And they start careers and they use that last little oomph of youth, right? The last little energy of youth to do something big. And I want to use my oomph of youth, the last little bits of oomph of youth, to go do something big too. But I also recognize that self-care has to come in here. I have to be a little bit more thoughtful about my choices. I can't stay up to 2:00 in the morning every night, right? And get up at 7. I got to maybe focus on my sleep a little bit more. That's like those kinds of things are real Damascene moments of like, maybe I need to take care of the structure that's going to try to get me through all the rest of my life.
You have to be more judicial in what you do and how you approach it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so those choices from youth and the people who we now build our lives around and are a part of our systems, they give us a lot of opportunities as we're doing self-care and as we're reflecting and as we're understanding a bigger picture other than just, what is it that I want out of life? It's like now there's a lot more going on. This gives us more and more opportunity to have our shadows reflected back to us, because the shadow, which is effectively anything we're unconscious about, Jung said that the shadow is something that we only get access to when it's reflected in another psyche, right? Like somebody else has to reflect our shadow back to us. We'll never see it on our own. And that's because it's our shadow, right? We're unconscious of it. So how else would we be able to see it? And people and circumstances as well, which is not really a psyche, but it's like it's a reflection back. We only understand our shadow when there's a mirror there. And so in midlife, this is an opportunity more and more to see that shadow. It's an opportunity to say, like, how did I get here, right? Like what were my choices and why did I make them? And why am I in this dynamic with this person? And why am I fighting over here? And why am I resisting this? And why is this the career that's going on? And why do I hate my boss or whatever it is, right? Why are my kids always so sassy, right? Like what's going on here? And so now more and more of our shadow is reflected back, and that opens up a whole new cognitive capacity. And that's why midlife is almost like it's like a second life. It's like the beginning of something more if we let it be, because it reflects back to us a bunch of content and information that we just simply didn't have access to before. And a fork in the road shows up. That fork is effectively, am I going to look at that shadow content and do something about it? Is my ego going to be so sensitive and fragile that when I get that content reflected back to me, I'm not going to look at it. I'm going to refuse to look at it. And I'm going to double down on my ego and whatever's there? Or am I going to be a person of resilience and receive some of that shadow content and make changes and understand there's way more to me than I realized before? And that's why it's the second birth, right? It's like a second time period of understanding ourselves completely anew if we let it be. It's not forced on us. We can go down that one path that goes, no, I'm going to double down on my ego. And I'm just going to be more of whatever I was before. And that's when one-sidedness gets so calcified that, weirdly enough, the shadow starts to grow. So we have a fork. Do I go down the road of seeing the shadow, or do I go down the road of the shadow taking up more and more territory inside of me? That is a big developmental change. And depending upon which road you go down, completely alters your relationship to your type.
Well, and we work with Dr. John Beebe directly. He's a Jungian psychotherapist. He developed the 8 function model and cognitive functions and personality type. He's an author, speaker. He's in his 80s, and we do personal coaching with him to expand our knowledge of both Jungian concepts and Myers-Briggs and personality type concepts. And one of the things we talked about with John in one of our most recent sessions when we were working with him is we were talking about this idea of shadow, and if the choice is made at midlife to not embrace some of the shadow material and look at it, the shadow can actually expand into territory we've already brought into the light. And that was blowing my mind as we were talking about this and he was sharing this with us. I was like, that resonates a lot. I've seen people, and we're going to talk about it in a moment here, elderhood, late adulthood, that it feels like they've lost something they once had. And I'm like, how is that possible? You're in your 70s or 80s. You should be the most mature, open-minded, well-rounded, expansive person ever that is you than you've ever been in your entire life. And yet you kind of hit this high water mark and you almost slunk back down into shadow material. There's things that people I knew them when they were in their midlife. You know, my parents' generation. I've known them. And I knew they were aware of things that they're not aware of about themselves now. Their shadow increased.
I'm related to some of these people.
I am too. And I'm like kind of terrified for myself. I'm like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to lose the awareness of how I'm showing up to other people. And I think it really speaks to that fork in the road. And a lot of people didn't have maybe somebody attune them to it. They didn't know what to do there. It's not like they had the roadmap in front of them. They chose not to follow the roadmap. They didn't maybe have awareness, and society and culture probably didn't support it at times in past too. But that horrifies me because I don't want to get into my elderhood and be less aware of myself and other people and be very myopic. I don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking at this going, I definitely want to choose the avenue, the pathway of let's bring this. I mean, it's painful. It's hard. I don't really like it. It's not, I mean, there's some good stuff in my shadow too that I find out about myself, but it's not always fun. And yet I'm looking at, 30 years, 40 years down the road going, I don't certainly want to end up like people I know, and not everybody I know, but enough that it's a warning. It's the canary in the coal mine for me. I'm like, I do not want to go that route. Well,
and you can tell when people made the choice to embrace their shadow or do shadow work, even if they don't know type. I mean, they just made the choice to
be aware of things.
Yeah, to understand more about who they are as people and not be so egotistically or egoistly fragile and, not double down and having to always be the person who's right. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Do you have to be a person who's always right? Like, can you just let go of that a little bit? Like, can you be wrong?
Input?
Yeah.
Can you hear other people and input and listen?
Yeah. And even on big stuff, like, can you have been wrong about major life choices? Can you have been wrong about your belief systems and structures? Like, if the answer is I can't be wrong about any of those stuff, I had to have been right the entire time, then you're just not going to be able to see shadow content because the shadow is like, no, you were wrong a lot of times. Right. But if you can go, yeah, no, I've been wrong a lot. In fact, maybe everything, right? Maybe everything's been wrong. And you're willing to see that and not have it crush you. That's the other thing, is that sometimes we think we're doing shadow work when really we're just self-flagellating.
Yeah.
We're just like, I'm a terrible, horrible person and I'm just awful and I'm like the worst. And it's like, that's not shadow work. That's just self-torture. You're just a masochist at that point. So you have to have the resilience to be able to look at the bad content and the good content that's in the shadow, because the shadow is anything you're unconscious of. And sometimes we resist good stuff because our ego doesn't like to see it for fill in the blank reason. But when we start receiving this information from the shadow, it's work because, you can't take it all in at one time. That would truly be crushing. Sometimes people have to do that. That's a terrible moment and it takes a while to recover. But if you can just bite off a little bit at a time and be willing to get feedback from the outside world on the things you have to work on and go, okay, you're right. I got to work on that thing. And you just kind of build up some resilience to it. Eventually you go, oh, it was actually my need to always be right. That was the burden, right? You start letting all of that go and you realize there's an extraordinary, phenomenal freedom in this space of just like, yeah, I was wrong. And then that's it. That's all. It doesn't have to be the end of the world. You just go, yeah, I'm not always right. Okay, done.
Yeah. And I would just, if you're listening along, one thing I could offer to you that I wrote on here is I think anywhere you have, if you're in midlife, anywhere you are still attached to an idealism, an ideal that hasn't bared out in reality in your life, and you're at midlife, so it hasn't bared out. Like you got the numbers, you got the math.
Right.
Like
you have the receipts.
I had a lot of idealism that didn't pan out, and if I'm getting to midlife and I double down on it should have been this ideal way. Well, now I'm really choosing not to see what is and how I contributed to what is in my life. I'm saying, no, I'm going to keep playing to this ideal outside of myself, and I'm not going to look at the shadow, and I'm going to just double down. And I think that's a recipe for suffering.
So can I ask you a quick question? I don't want to go too much on a
Sure.
tangent. But as somebody with intuitive feeler preferences, which, Kiersey called the idealists, how do you, as in somebody with ENFP preferences, reconcile this idea of too much idealism is actually going to prevent me from being able to see shadow content, but I also am somebody who's pre-wired to be a little bit more idealistic? What's the reconciliation there?
It's tough. It's hard. I'm in the midst of it, actually, in a lot of ways. I'm letting go a lot of that idealism. I think for me, the idealisms are okay as long as they are Like I still think in idealistic terms, like what's possible, but in intention, not in actuality. So like I would like a world that people are peaceful and kind to each other. But if that's a metric and not an intention, I'm going to have a lot of suffering in my life. So I've detached ideals from metrics and I've attached them more to intentions and directions of things going. And so that's how I've reconciled it. I've reconnected it to a different kind of framework. Mm-hmm. And so as long as we're moving in the right direction toward the ideal, and I recognize that an ideal by definition can never be achieved, I can let go of some of that being the metric of the ideal itself. Because I think that's what I was always thinking. It's, we can get to this. I think that's really where an NF has to make the shift, is we can get to this as a metric, as a measurement. And I don't think that's possible. I don't think an ideal can be a measurement. I think it's just an intention.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for clarifying that, because I think that makes me think of Tony Robbins' disempowering rules.
Yeah.
Which is that disempowering rules are when we say things have to be just so in order for me to be okay, or in order for me to be happy. And he said that those are totally disempowering. It's like, well, the most empowering rule is no matter what happens, I'm going to have fun. So what I hear you saying is that you haven't let go of the desire, the idealistic desire. You still want that, and you still have it as an intention. You're going to move towards that, and you're going to try to build this world that you'd like to see. But you're going to let go of the disempowering role of having to have it, right? Yeah. And if it doesn't happen, then I'm going to be upset, or it's not okay. Is that effectively it?
I think that's very close to how it feels for me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you. So going back to this idea of midlife to now late adulthood, this is another big step. And by the way, that fork in the road of midlife, the one where the shadow grows, right? That's one-sidedness. That's another way of Jung saying one-sidedness. But the other path, when you start to incorporate the shadow, that's individuation, right? Individuation being like, there's a bigger self and there's a lot of content in there. And the more you're willing to go through the shadow content, the more individuated you become, because there's not this separation between how you see yourself and legit aspects of yourself that you're refusing to look at, right? You now individuate. You are no longer a house divided. So then, depending upon which direction you went, you're going to have a very different experience in late adulthood. But late adulthood would come no matter what. And so this is basically the age of 65 and onward. And now, instead of signs of aging becoming relevant, this is where signs of aging, or basically the aging process, is the main thing, right? This is what's happening. And it becomes a central theme, right? And you can see this, like our parents both became the kind of people who we have to connect with them around their hospital doctor visits, right? It's like, hey, you want to come on vacation with us? And they're like, oh, I have like 3 doctor's visits that week. And we're like, 3? What about the next week? Oh no, I've got one then too. And it's like, oh, so we actually have to work around your doctor visit schedule as like a central part of our relationship with you. Like if we're going to go do stuff. And that becomes a central theme as you age. Right. This is now, doctor visits are a major part. Pills are a major part. Like you have those pill boxes that say Saturday through Sunday, and every single one of them has a pill in them. And this is keeping you alive and keeping you healthy. And everything is sort of organized around doing the most you can for your health to keep yourself not just alive, but to keep yourself in as high quality of life as possible.
Now, I think that's a development in the last 100 years. I don't think human history has dealt with this.
No.
I think that is a very modern and Western experience for people.
Yeah.
And I don't think necessarily other cultures or times past dealt with the same frameworks.
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. But extending life and as high quality of life as possible has always been a theme for anybody who gets past this age, a certain age.
And so technologies comes in here. Basically, visiting the doctor is technologically keeping you alive longer and in better health than maybe just living out your days until it was over.
Yeah. And I think what I remember reading at some point is that in times past, people actually did have long lives. They could live into their 70s and 80s, but very few people made it that far. And so the reason why like the mortality rate was so low or whatever, like the average lifespan was in the 40s and 50s in certain time periods, is because, most people just didn't make it to a certain point. And of course the infant mortality rate skewed all the numbers. But if you did make it into that time period, you usually had habits that were strong and you just kept those going, but you were going to still slow down. You were going to still have this be a big part. And the reason why that's relevant is because now contending with mortality is also the central theme. Like, you're going to die. It's coming soon, right? And by soon, I don't mean like in the next couple of years. It could be in a couple decades, but you know it's coming. It's not one of those things that you can pretend will never happen to you. When you're young, the reason why there's a phrase forever young is because when you're young, you do not have to contend with your mortality as a general rule. Some people have tragic situations happen. Some people, we say that they were taken too soon, right? That does happen. But for the majority of people, you're in your 20s, you are not thinking about death. Some people are, but not because your body is telling you to do so.
Yeah.
Right? So certain traits naturally increase and decrease, right? There's going to be certain things that you rest into. Oftentimes, we expand to explore things that we never were able to do during, our younger days. So now bucket lists, the concept of a bucket list becomes a thing. But you're also, maybe not as capable of doing some of those things. So now it's not uncommon to explore a more sort of existential world, a philosophical world, something that's more about like, what exactly do I believe? And what do I think is going to happen after all of this is over? And how am I going to contend with that concept? And then the choice one made to either go down, even more one-sidedness versus individuation now massively influences a person's type capacity, right? And how they're going to show up. So if you went down the individuation road, you have access to all sorts of cognitive capacities that you might never have really tapped into before. You might have, even more access to your shadow functions. You might be somebody who's really like tapping into things that were always maybe distasteful before. And now they're like a fun thing to explore about yourself. And you can see when people have really done that because they they just feel so secure and rested in on themselves. And while the thing you mentioned before is a tragedy that people in this age bracket start to feel invisible, the people who chose the individuation path, they should not be invisible. They should be our models and our guides. We should be looking to them to go, what were the choices you made in your life that got you here? Because that is badass. And I want to end up at that place. We really should be honoring and respecting anybody who chose the individuation path.
Well, and as technology develops and keeps us alive longer, people say that the first person to live to 150, maybe 200 or beyond has already been born. Like
150, I think it was.
They live among us right now. Like there might be technology that allows you and me, Antonia, to extend our lives well into our hundreds. We don't know yet. Like, technology is evolving very fast.
Yeah, I'm going to get a facelift. So I'm ready.
Well, but it means that, let's say somebody has the capacity to live a lot longer, but they didn't do that individuation process. That's a sentence of like more and more myopia and one-sidedness on an even longer timeline. Like, what a horrible thing for somebody.
Or it's yet another rebirth cycle.
Maybe there's opportunities. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what will come of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah. And so that would be really cool. And
you get a second chance.
A second chance. That's right. And so regardless of whether or not that technology does become available to us in that time, there is the path of individuation, like you mentioned before, the sentence of one-sidedness would be horrible. But I think you can really tell the difference between people who went down a path of individuation, because the ones who chose that one-sidedness and really doubled down, it's almost like they revert back to like childlike fantasies.
Yeah.
And that's what you see. You see people who are like, no, it works this way. And you're like, what? You've lived for 80 years and you think it works that way? Why would you think it works that way? But there's almost like a fantasy quality that takes over. And so they revert back to almost a silly place.
Yeah.
And I think observing that at times has undermined people's sort of respect for people in their elderhood, is that we do see that sometimes happen.
Yeah. I don't think it's ever too late to turn the ship around. It's hard to do it the older you are, because you just have so many habits and mental wiring and, your mind wants to take the path of least resistance. So it creates these quick, neural pathways to save time and be efficient. So it's really hard to make a change later in life. It's harder to learn things. Your mind's not as plastic, all these things we know about the mind. But it's possible. I think the advice for middle-aged people, like in midlife, is you have this reset moment. You have a time period to reevaluate and make the path choice of becoming more individuated, like Jung talked about, and not just doubling down on the one-sidedness, like, rounding out your whole personality. And I think younger people, both people in their adolescence and young adulthood can start the habits that will put them on good footings for when they hit midlife to have that reset moment, because you don't know what that reset moment's going to be. You have no idea. But you're going to have that moment where maybe you've got good habits that will support your ability, like good frameworks and habits, maybe understanding personality types is one of them, that will put you on good footing to make the choices for the later life. So I think there's advice here for all the stages of development. And if you're a little kid, you should just listen to your parents.
Yeah, just listen to them.
If you're under 10, do you hear that, Piper?
Unless they're terrible people.
Are you listening?
Piper, your parents are not. So to maybe borrow some from the previous podcast about how personal growth helps a person understand type theory so much better.
Yeah.
This is the usual development. If a person's into growth and into personal growth, the entire purpose of personal growth is to accelerate maturity.
Yeah.
So there are going to be people who are in midlife who are accessing things that maybe they would have had to wait for elderhood. Like they're deep in their individuation process. Or there might be people who are younger, like in their young adulthood, who are sort of tapping into this idea of things that would normally be reserved for people in their midlife. So it just accelerates this process. Now, I will say this, there are certain things that you cannot access until you get to midlife.
Yeah.
They're just not available. It doesn't matter how much personal growth and development work you do. There is nothing that is going to be a substitute for experience. And that's what you have when you hit midlife. You have a ton of experience. It doesn't matter what the experience is, you will have learned a ton of lessons from that. So there are some things that personal growth cannot help you access until you get there. There are things that I will never know until my body starts breaking down for death. I just don't have access to them. I just don't have that experience. So I'm never going to be able to tap into all of the elements that come later.
But you can start contending with your mortality now.
Right.
Like you can start the process of like working and going, okay, I am going to die someday, and not just pushing that into a future date. Mm-hmm. Bring that forward. That will mature you as a person.
You got it. Yeah, exactly. And so to route this back to this concept of type, so there are certain things that come online, and I know that this podcast has gone a little long, but but I do want to kind of wrap it up with this idea of how type gets woven into all of this. There are some cognitive capacities that start to come online at certain time periods. And it's not just that they come online, but it is, again, the relationship of them coming online with the environment and the lessons they take when they get that feedback. So if you're looking at it through the lens of cognitive function specifically in relationship to type, our dominant, what we call our driver function in the car model, that starts to really come online in a big way when you are in your early childhood. You start to access that and you start asserting it. And the environment's response to the assertion of your first function is going to inform a ton around how that function shows up for you until you do rewiring or reprogramming later. All right. So you can see that because there's a lot of people who later in life have, say, permission issues around just being themselves. I don't feel like I have permission to be myself. That was a lot of stuff that was imprinted in early childhood around how they're showing up with that first function. The second function has traditionally been said to start coming online in adolescence. But the challenge with that second function is that it just naturally has what Dr. John Beebe would call apparent energy. So we start to explore that second function. It becomes alive for us, but we're mostly thinking about it in terms of making an impact, right? Isn't it that second time period that it's toward adolescent, a little bit before that is when industry starts to come in and achievements. So oftentimes we're using it in an achievement way, but then we're also using it in relationship way and friendship and intimacy and that sort of thing. We're mostly using it to interface with others. That third function, which has always been there, It has the energy of a child. So it's actually, in some ways, sometimes more dominant.
It's a 10-year-old tertiary function.
Right, the 10-year-old or tertiary function. Sometimes it's more obvious in childhood and adolescence because it already has the energy of a child, right? It's the eternal child part of us. Whereas that second function is more of a parent energy. So even though it comes online and we start to explore it, that relationship between that second and third function is usually not very sophisticated, right? It's not really, we're not really owning all of those parts of ourselves. We're sort of captured by them and playing them out in response to our environment. And once again, our environment is going to inform our opinion of how they should show up. So if we start showing up with that second function and everybody calls us a know-it-all, like ETPs get, or sometimes ITJs, right? Our thinking functions are second function, and people are like, you're just being a know-it-all. We'll go, okay, I guess this is unacceptable. Yeah. Even though my thinking function is my parent function and I am instinctively using it in behalf of other people, apparently I'm too young to use it in this capacity to get positive feedback. So now I'm going to retreat, right?
Well, that's a pretty sophisticated thing to say. Apparently I'm too young to. I think the interpretation would be, oh, this is bad and wrong. I should just push it away altogether.
You got it, right? Yeah, absolutely. So then it's like this complicated relationship with the feeling function for these types. And then there would be a version of this for basically every iteration, right? Was it acceptable to the environment or was it punished by the environment? What did it tell me about my ability to have relationships and build intimacy? Is it something that other people are going to reject or is it something that is going to be acceptable? Okay, all of this alters how we're going to develop as people of certain personality types. Then when we get to early adulthood, now we get in the slipstream of life and the demands of life and what career did we choose? And now that tertiary, that 10-year-old function, that eternal child function really starts to come online in a way where we're leveraging it to try to get approval for our life choices, right? And it's like, I'm now choosing a career. I'm proving to everybody that I'm good at this. And we have an opportunity during this time period to grow our second function, our auxiliary or co-pilot, in a way where we start to self-parent with it. And that's really where personal growth turns the relationship of our type completely around. That's how you turn the franchise around, is you start self-parenting with that second function, which is why we at Personality Hacker always say that the co-pilot is the leverage point. So these are all things that are available to us, but depending upon the choices we make, whether or not we instinctively understand this, there are a ton of people who have made the right choices. They have made choices that are very healthy for them, and people who made choices that are not healthy for them, being completely ignorant of type at all. It's just a thing that's starting to happen inside of us. Now, when we know type, we can start to, sort of lighten up and put the puzzle pieces together and go, oh, this is what's going on for me. And that's a major leg up because now you can be conscious around it and make conscious choices around it. But it's happening inside of us whether or not we're aware of it. And then later on down the road, when we get to that midlife piece, we have the capacity to start really building a relationship with our fourth function in a way more sophisticated way than ever before. It's still, when we're younger, it's still an aspiration for us. It's still in there. Sometimes we reject it. Sometimes we over-embrace it. We have an on-on relationship with that fourth function, that inferior function, what we call the 3-year-old. But in our midlife, because we have more access to the shadow, there are a lot of Jungian analysts that say that the fourth function is the beginning of the shadow. That's the first place it is. And so that's the beginning of our work, is to really integrate that part of who we are. And we have an opportunity to do that. If we don't, though, if we don't start to grow that piece of us, then by later adulthood, elderhood, our shadow might have actually started to eclipse our third function, sometimes our second function. It can get really bad. Our one-sidedness can be 100%. We might even have our first function in our shadow, right? That's how bad it can get. But if we embrace the shadow, that fourth function becomes a keystone to all of it. And then that's our access point to other parts of who we are. So type development, personal growth, accelerating maturity, making sure that we're on path, whether it's happening consciously or, without us being aware, all of these things massively influence how we as an individual are going to show up as a unique expression of our type. And that's one of the reasons why understanding all of this is really crucial for us, not just for us as personal growth enthusiasts, but also as type enthusiasts, because it informs every aspect of type theory.
Yeah. So I'll ask you, you've been listening and watching along. How old are you? Like, basically, where are you at in this timeline? Like, I mean, what's your experience with some of the things we're talking about? Are you in adolescence and you're listening and watching us right now? Are you in young adulthood? Are you in midlife? Are you in your elder years? I'm guessing you're not a young child under the age of 10, although maybe you are too. Come over. It doesn't matter. Ask your parents' permission before you come over, but come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, ask a question, share a comment, but more importantly, let us know what's coming up for you. We haven't had a third microphone for you to speak on this episode, but we do want to hear your thoughts as you're listening along and you're placing yourself on this timeline of development and you're going, okay, I kind of see how that's showing up in my life. I kind of resonate with what you're talking about. Maybe you're a person in midlife. I'll just pick one of those. And you're really resonating with this idea of the squeeze and the reset moment, the opportunity to individuate or to continue to double down on one-sidedness. Maybe you've had really great habits, and so you're in a great place at midlife. Or you've got a little bit of work to do because some of those habits didn't serve you so well. So you've got a little extra you've got to push here to do some reset. What is your experience? What's your story? We want to hear from you. Come over again and make your voice heard.
And those of you in a late adulthood, elderhood,
yeah,
you're not invisible.
Well, come bring us advice. I want to hear from you and learn from you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And did you choose the path of individuation? Tell me all about it.
Yeah.
What does it look like? Please, please, please give us your wisdom because you're not invisible. You're incredibly important. And I would like you to know that I honor and respect your journey through life. It might not be, you're not the only one that did it, right? But I don't think that just because traveling along life is every day, that doesn't mean that it's not still an exceptional feat. So come over and tell us all about it. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We also have a video podcast that you might be watching us on right now. If you do, like, subscribe, maybe leave a comment there, and let us know, as Joel mentioned, what's going on for you at this time period of development in your life. You can also hit a little bell that lets you know when new episodes come out. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type at personalityhacker.com. So head over to our website, personalityhacker.com, look at the catalog, and see which one of those programs is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.